You've seen this trick 1,000 times. Hollywood takes a person, puts a smile on them, and sells it to you as eternal. He's funny, he's easygoing, he's ours. He never breaks. As long as he smiles, they carry him on their hands. The moment the smile falls out of rhythm, the real accounting begins. The mechanism is simple and very convenient for the system. First, they give you an image. A nice guy, a good-natured clown, a comedy genius who can always handle it. Then they bolt a contract, airtime, ratings, advertising money, a schedule that doesn't ask if you have a heart, sleep, or a nervous system onto that image. And the most cynical part, they judge you not as a person, but as a function. Making people laugh, you work. Not making them laugh, you're broken. After that, everything happens quietly and professionally. They patch you up with pills, smooth over scandals, clean up the press, push the boundaries of what's normal, as long as the cash register keeps ringing. And when there's nothing left inside, they package it up nicely. He was just tired. It's the price of fame. It happens. And no one asks the main question: who paid and who sent the bill? Today, we'll go through 10 comedians who made America howl with laughter, while they themselves paid for that laughter with their health, their marriages, their sanity, and sometimes their own lives. Not gossip for gossip's sake, but for the sake of understanding how the industry turns talent into a disposable resource, and why comedians, more than anyone, are forbidden from being alive. And we'll start with a man who could destroy anyone's self-importance with a single look, and yet was a prisoner of his own image his entire life. Groucho Marx. On screen, the eternal, cold-blooded wisecracker. But here's the question. What was left of him when the makeup was washed off, the jokes ended, and the lights in the studio went out? On the posters, they sold him as pure poison with a mustache and a cigar. Groucho Marx, the king of sardonic jokes, a man who could demolish any important guy on stage, in movies, on radio, on television with a single sentence. For half a century straight, he played the same character, an insolent genius who sees right through people and fears neither the rich nor politicians. Sometime in the 1920s, that act had its last normal day. In a Broadway review, they still printed his real name, Julius Marx, alongside his brothers with their real names. Biographers write that after that, it was curtains. From morning till night, he was only Groucho. Even his brothers stopped calling him Julius and switched to his stage name. The person was still there, in a way, but the only access to him was through the makeup. And Hollywood really liked that format. Why would they need a live Julius with anxieties and breakdowns when they had a perfectly honed Groucho who always delivered a joke, always kept the rhythm, always brought in the box office? Success in movies, a radio show, then a television quiz show he hosted for years. Everything was arranged so that the character was the one moving through the world. The character doesn't need weekends, vacations, or heart-to-heart talks. The character needs lights, a camera, and other people's mistakes to elegantly skewer. The nastiest part is that the system, in cases like this, doesn't even force you. It just creates the conditions. They pay you for your wit, for that trademark smirk, for not letting guests or the audience relax. But for you being a gentle husband and father in the evening, nobody pays for that. And when, after the stock market crash in the late 1920s, he nearly went under financially and refused to go on stage, they literally blackmailed him back into the lineup. A composer, Friendly, offered to play his role of Captain Spaulding himself, and Groucho crawled back. Because even in his depression, he was more afraid of a bad replacement than of his own exhaustion. In public, it looked like a joke, a quote from one of his movies. No audience deserves to look at you all evening. But behind the scenes, the man could no longer admit that he was scared and unwell, because they expected a good line from him, not emotions. That's the verdict. The live Julius was fired, and Groucho Marx stepped in to replace him forever. At home, it was the same story. 3 marriages, and all of them ended in divorce. 3 women who, by all accounts, just started drinking to endure the endless barbs. Those same trademark takedowns he used to slap the egos of ministers and tycoons, he'd dish out at the family table, in the living room, in front of friends. Because he no longer had any other way of talking, the don't joke mode just wouldn't load. And yeah, he did get his money back in the end, earned many times more than he lost that Black Autumn. But a biographer writes plainly, he was never able to relax, spent his whole life expecting to wake up broke again tomorrow. Hence the obsessive routines about greed and debts. Hence the constant anxiety that was easiest to hide behind yet another killer line aimed at his wife, kids, or whichever guest. The saddest part is that toward the end of his life, when the makeup sat strangely and his voice cracked, almost all the people around him were those who loved Groucho, not the lost Julius. And how the industry clings to the mask, even when the person underneath is crumbling, is very clearly seen in the next character, who decided he could control everything himself, and drowned in that control up to his ears. If Groucho got stuck in his role, Jerry Lewis decided to control that role personally, and everything else along with it. America's eternal child, a rubber face in a tuxedo, falling down stairs, breaking furniture, and getting back up to applause. The public saw a sweet idiot who always got into trouble. Off camera, he was a man who could never get over being left once upon a time. The main crack happened in the mid-50s when he and Dean Martin walked off the stage of New York's Copacabana for the last time. It was exactly 10 years after their first performance together. Backstage, no drama. They shook hands, went out separate doors. Years later, Jerry himself admitted he was the one who broke up the duo because he was increasingly pulling the blanket over himself, wanting to decide what every shot, every show would be like. Dean wanted to sing and play golf. Lewis wanted to be the author, director, and god of that little world. The industry only poured gasoline on this character trait. In the late 50s, he was given a contract that, by studio system standards, looked like a coronation. Several films over 7 years, his own producer status, and a share of the profits. Read that as total control. Now he wasn't just an actor falling off a piano. He was a company called Jerry Lewis Productions. He wrote, shot, directed, and played himself. It was very convenient for the studio. One guy who handles everything and is responsible for everything. And very convenient for Jerry, who never again wanted to find himself in a "I've been dumped" position. Then it got worse. According to accounts, he started editing even other people's movies. Guests would come over, and he'd sit them down to watch his corrected versions of famous films, where he'd cut out scenes he didn't like with scissors. This wasn't about creativity anymore. It was about panic. If you can't rewrite the memory of Dean simply walking out of your life, you rewrite everything you can get your hands on. The harsh verdict here is simple. Jerry tried to edit reality the way you'd edit a film, and reality didn't forgive him for it. The most cynical part is that show business helped him do it. In the mid-60s in Las Vegas, during a routine, he tried to perform a double somersault off a piano on stage and crashed badly. This didn't stop the conveyor belt. As a result, as he later told it, he damaged his spine and earned himself decades of immense pain. They took him to the hospital, and afterwards, doctors started handing out painkillers. First 1 pill a day, by his account, then the doses grew to a dozen or more per day. No one told him enough, because a sick Jerry on screen still brought in money. It was a classic exchange. The industry got a star who worked even with a broken back, and he got a constant stream of prescription painkillers and permission to never stop. The price was addiction, which dragged on for years, plus a body he himself called a source of immense, constant pain. And even here, in an interview, he says one terrifying phrase: when he goes on stage, the pain disappears. Meaning the only real remedy for pain that actually worked for him was playing the clown for the audience again. At home, it was even more painful. 6 sons from his first marriage remember not a comedian, but a man who was often cruel, harsh, hence the stories about physical and emotional toughness. One of the younger ones later told the press that in their house, it was the norm, not the exception. When that son died in his 40s, reportedly from an overdose, Jerry reportedly blamed himself, but did nothing particularly public about it. We see a man who controls everything except the most terrible thing: losses within his own family. The coldest gesture came at the very end. Shortly before his death, he made a will, leaving his entire fortune and film rights to his second wife and their daughter together. The 6 sons from his first marriage were listed there by name as people who received nothing. Not a cent, not a symbolic gesture that, "You're still my kids." This wasn't just a personality conflict, it was a legally formalized break between a father and his own past. And here you can clearly see how the system encourages such breaks. It gives a man money, power, the chance to be the sole author, and then calmly watches as he applies that power directly to those closest to him. If Groucho hounded his family at home with his sarcastic tongue, Jerry, by the end of his life, turned his fatherhood into an act of final editing, cutting out of the final version anyone who reminded him of pain. Next on our list is a character for whom this cult of control and power reached the point of absurdity. He wasn't satisfied with just recutting other people's movies. He tried to edit entire generations of comedians. If Jerry Lewis tried to control everything around him, Milton Berle lived from childhood in a world where he was controlled. A kid from Harlem, literally ripped from his family by his mother, she left her husband, her other children, a normal life behind, and dragged him across the country like a walking ATM. She even took his stage name for herself. He didn't become Berle. They both did. The real family stayed somewhere in the past, and afterwards, only Sarah the manager and her little gold mine named Milton existed. This woman didn't just manage her son's career. According to accounts, if Milton dated a girl more than 3 times, Sarah would find a way to ruin it. She'd call, show up, make scenes, do everything to make the relationship fall apart. Partners who could have given him even a drop of normalcy were automatically sent to the slaughter. The rule was simple. The son belongs to the stage and to mom, not to some girl. And the most frightening part? It worked right up until the end. In the late 80s, when Milton was already over 80, he admitted to journalists himself, "My mother interfered in my relationships until she was old. She lived to be 94 and never let go of the leash for a single day." Then television came and turned this circus into a religion. In the late 40s, Milton hosts a show on Tuesdays, and the country literally pauses. The ratings hit over 90%. This isn't just a number, it's a national holding of breath. Restaurants close, streets empty, utility companies record a drop in water consumption because people are afraid to go to the bathroom and miss a joke. They call him Mr. Television. Not just as a fancy title, but because on Tuesday nights, all of America belongs to him. For this, the network signs a contract with him 30 years in advance, with a fixed sum that by the standards of the time sounds like the salary of a small nation. This is where the trap begins. Television gave him something even his mother couldn't, the feeling that he was the center of the universe. Not an actor, not a comedian, a god. Every Tuesday, the whole world pauses for him. But there's a problem. Gods don't age, but ratings do. By the mid-50s, the numbers start to drop. The sponsor leaves. The show is renamed. They try to revive it, change the format, bring in guests. Nothing works. Eventually, the program is quietly canceled. The contract remains. Money trickles in until the early 80s, but they never give him the main thing again, the feeling that the planet freezes when he opens his mouth. And Milton breaks the way only people who were taught from childhood that their worth is measured in applause can break. A critic writes a devastating review. Berle's style is outdated. The audience has gotten smarter. They expect subtle humor, not cheap gags. Milton reads it and calls the author. Not to yell, not to threaten, but to ask, why? What for? The critic later recalled he barely recognized the voice. This wasn't Mr. Television. This was a broken man who didn't understand how to live if the number on the report no longer said you were needed. Because from infancy, he was trained on one simple formula. Real emotions are worthless. The currency is laughter. And here's the proof. During one program from his golden era, studio audiences notice a strange, piercing laugh that would regularly trigger waves of laughter throughout the hall. Professional, perfectly timed, hitting exactly the right moments. Later it comes out. It's Sarah. Mother is sitting in the audience, conducting the crowd with her correct laughter. Even the applause Milton heard his whole life was partly her work. Imagine, you're standing on stage and your mom is in the audience, manually swaying the crowd to love you just a little bit more. Toward the end of the 70s, he's invited to host a live comedy program for a new generation. For him, it's a last chance to get back to where he was a god. But Milton shows up not as a guest, but as the boss. He starts giving orders, rewriting sketches, imposing that same old vaudeville style that the project is precisely trying to get away from. Everyone politely tolerates it because he's a legend after all. By the end of the episode, Milton decides to give himself a nice finale. Sing a sentimental song and get a standing ovation. He pre-positions a dozen acquaintances in the balcony with one task. When I finish singing, stand up. The song ends. The balcony stands, but the main floor stays seated. They just sit and watch. The silence lasts a few seconds, but those few seconds are enough to make it clear. The trick doesn't work anymore. There it is, the verdict. The man for whom an entire country once came to a standstill, in his old age, buys himself a fake ovation, and still gets emptiness in return. The episode was cut from reruns. The network never invited him again. But he kept going where they'd still give him a microphone. He'd show up at youth awards, where he no longer sensed the audience or the boundaries of decency. He'd tell dick jokes on camera, grab young actresses, act like it was still 1949 and he could get away with anything. He looked increasingly pathetic and alien, but he couldn't leave because leaving would mean admitting that Mr. Television was dead, and all that was left was an old man nobody was waiting for. At home, it was even worse. His son William published a memoir in the late 90s, describing his father as a man who was practically absent from his life, and in old age turned into a pathetic ghost of his own fame. Milton read it and simply cut his son out of his life. Announced he would never speak to him again. No attempt to understand, no questions. Just final edit, you no longer exist. When William died, Milton wasn't at the funeral. Toward the end, Berle himself was diagnosed with colon cancer, but he refused surgery. According to those close to him, he just didn't want to admit that time was up. Looking at this story from the outside, everything is visible as if under a magnifying glass. A mother taught her child that he only exists on stage. Television confirmed this lesson with numbers and contracts. And then the industry calmly watched as a man spent 40 years chasing that percentage that was gone forever. Next on the list is a comedian who wasn't deprived of the right to be himself by a contract or ratings, but by his own characters. So much so that without someone else's accent and makeup, he simply didn't know what to say. If Milton chased a number and lost himself, Peter Sellers didn't even know what he was losing. They sold him as the perfect chameleon, a man who could become anyone. Inspector Clouseau, Dr. Strangelove, Chance the gardener from being there. Audiences looked at him and saw dozens of different people, each with their own walk, voice, expression. Except that when filming ended, there was no one underneath. Peter himself talked about this openly, not in a therapist's confession, but right on camera, playing himself in a film. His words sounded like a joke, but in fact were a scream. I don't exist. I don't know who I am. If you asked me to play myself, I couldn't. And when the hosts of one show advised him to just be himself, he replied, "That's the problem. There is no me." The director who shot him in the famous comedies later explained the essence of this nightmare to journalists. Peter would stay in character even after filming and at home, because he liked not being Peter Sellers. But a character is just a drawing. It has no real roots, so it can't last long. And when the character falls apart, the actor falls apart with it, because under the mask there's nothing but emptiness. Hollywood, in a situation like this, could have said, "Stop, take a break, go see doctors, figure it out." But the industry didn't go that route. One of his ex-wives said outright that Peter needed help, medication, treatment for mental instability, but he didn't get it because he was too valuable to the studios. As long as an actor works on set and makes money, no one is going to risk a break, even if that actor doesn't know who he is without makeup. The most horrifying part is that his body started failing too. In the mid-60s, right after the premiere of The Pink Panther, which took off like a rocket, Peter came home with his family, opened a bottle of champagne, and collapsed. His heart stopped, then started again, then stopped again. In a single night, by his own account, he went through 8 cardiac arrests. The doctors had almost given up hope of saving him. He was 38. Career at its peak, the role of Clouseau made him a world star, and at that very moment, his body literally tried to kill him 8 times in a row. Later he joked that he was used to dying, like, "How many times can you?" But underneath that joke was pure terror. A man who couldn't be himself began to physically disintegrate. Another line of pressure came from inside his own relationships. He married a Swedish actress. A few days after their first date, he simply announced they would get married. Didn't ask, announced. And then, according to her memories, he started choosing her clothes, deciding what she would wear, and every Friday regularly threatened divorce, only to apologize by Monday with gifts and dinner. This wasn't love. It was an attempt to control something, anything, when there was no foundation inside. The characters he played could take a punch, make plans, carry on dialogues. Peter himself couldn't do any of it. Studios knew. Directors saw. Colleagues were aware. But everyone needed Sellers the actor, not Sellers the person. They'd put him in a new film with a new character, and he'd hide again in an accent, a walk, someone else's way of speaking. And without that, nothing. One biographer wrote that toward the end, he'd sit in hotel rooms, alone, sick with heart trouble, so alienated from everyone that no one really knew him anymore. Peter Sellers died in a hotel at 54. His heart simply stopped. According to hospital representatives, it just gave out. No home, no one nearby. An empty room where, essentially, there hadn't been a person for many years. The characters ate him alive. And if you think that's the limit, next is the story of a comedian who wasn't just crushed by the industry, but was completely owned by one specific woman, his wife, composer, manager, and the one who, even on stage, pulled his invisible strings, changing the key of the accompaniment so he would sing the way she wanted. Danny Kaye seemed like America's easiest, kindest comedian, a red whirlwind on stage, juggling language so that words twisted into impossible tongue twisters, and children laughed just from watching him move. On screen, they sold him as a man with no dark sides, the eternal good uncle, always in motion and always happy. But off camera, he was a man who, according to colleagues' memories, could be on top of the world one minute and in a deep hole the next. It all started fairly classically. In the spring of '39, he came to an audition. Sylvia Fine was at the piano. She wrote music and lyrics. He was desperately looking for work. Within a few months, they were inseparable, and in early 1940, they got married somewhere in Florida, hastily before a justice of the peace who was still finishing his dinner while they waited. It wasn't a big romantic gesture. It was a merger of interests. He needed material. She needed a performer. After that, Sylvia became more than just a wife. She wrote his songs, managed his career, decided which roles to take. Without her material, Danny was just another vaudeville guy with fast feet and a funny voice. But the harshest part came out later, when she herself admitted that even during performances, she controlled him from the piano. If she thought he was singing too tensely, she'd subtly change the octave, make the pitch higher and lighter, and Danny, without realizing it, would follow the music and soften. They didn't guide him with words, they led him on an invisible leash. Danny himself told journalists that Sylvia was more of a mother than a wife. Not a partner, not a lover, a mother who corrects, adjusts, and never fully approves. Somewhere around 47, this scheme started cracking. By then, Danny was a movie star. Films came out one after another. The public adored him. But around him, whispers grew louder. Is he actually talented, or does Sylvia do all the work and he's just her puppet? A biographer writes that for 7 years straight, they asked him to bow in her direction and perform under her direction. And at some point, it became too heavy. Danny felt growing guilt. All the spotlight was on him, but the success wasn't his. In September 47, he left Sylvia. The split lasted a few months, and during this time, according to documents, Danny suffered a nervous breakdown. He was shooting a film, but every day production would literally stop because he had to leave to see a psychiatrist. Not once a week, but almost every day. Imagine, a star at the peak of fame so broken that film production can't proceed without breaks for therapy. The breakdown itself, as they write, was tied to feelings of inadequacy. Danny wanted to know once and for all whether he could be a hit on his own, or if without Sylvia, he was nothing. That's the verdict. The studio gets a star who physically cannot work without a psychiatrist, but keeps filming, and the star pays for it with direct access to psychosis. In early 48, he fled to England to test himself. He took a 6-week contract at the London Palladium without Sylvia's dominant material. Critics later wrote that it took him 95 seconds to become the greatest triumph of English music hall in the last 30 years. They couldn't get him off the streets. He couldn't leave the theater between shows even for lunch. Food was brought directly to his dressing room. So he proved it. Yes, he was talented without Sylvia. Yes, he could do it alone. But this victory turned into a new trap. Now he knew for sure that the public wanted exactly this manic energy, this whirlwind that never stops. And if it stops, will the love remain? Over time, it only got worse. One article from the late 50s calls him a man who 1 minute is on top of the world, the next is miserable. Danny himself admitted in interviews, "Yes, I have emotional problems, but internal things are a personal matter for everyone." Meaning he saw he was falling apart, but the system tacitly told him, "Keep smiling. Your depression is not our concern." By the mid-60s, one producer who worked on his TV show described Danny as the loneliest man he had ever met. According to him, Danny lived in a penthouse above the studio, and no one saw him, including his own wife. Sylvia didn't go up to see him. He isolated himself completely, because when you feel bad, the last thing you want is to be around people. But his job required him to be around people every day. So he'd go out, perform for millions, and then return to an empty apartment where there was no one. And next on our list is a man whom live television and a performance schedule didn't just isolate, but literally turned into a walking dead man. His own definition, for 18 years. If Danny locked himself in a penthouse, Sid Caesar drove himself to the state he would later call a walking dead man. And not for a year, but for 18 years straight. The king of sketches, creator of a show that later landed in the top programs of all time. Audiences saw brilliant parodies, impeccable timing, routines you couldn't duplicate. And in the dressing room after the broadcast sat a man who no longer understood who he was without those 90 minutes of live TV. Because the workload was absolutely insane. Starting in the early 50s, he delivered 90 minutes of live television every week, 39 weeks a year. Not a half-hour sitcom with taping and retakes, but an hour and a half with no room for error, live on air. Figure almost 60 hours of new material every year. No one had done that before. Legends like Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, later Woody Allen and Neil Simon sat in the writer's room, and Brooks later recalled it was a zoo, everyone shouting lines, jokes rewritten 50 times. The studio got genius content every week. High ratings, ads rolling, awards pouring in. The price? Sid paid with his nerves. He'd walk into that writer's room not as a colleague, but as a volcano. According to accounts, he'd punch holes in walls with his fists, once knocked out a horse that had thrown his wife. And when Mel Brooks, during a night session in a Chicago hotel, said he wanted to leave, Sid simply picked him up and dangled him out the window. 18th floor. Calmly asked, "Want to go further?" If Sid's brother hadn't been there, who knows how it would have ended. Everyone put up with it because the show was genius and Sid was brilliant. When you're creating a masterpiece, people turn a blind eye to the monster. That's the Hollywood deal. The studio gets a masterpiece and the writers get a lottery. Either you write the best routine of your career or you end up dangling over the street. When the show ended in '58, Sid crashed. A biographer writes that he was literally crushed by the pressure of sudden fame, constant headlining, the weekly marathon. His career went into a nosedive, and then came the alcohol and pills. The doctors he went to prescribed everything: Valium, Equinil, sleeping pills. No one said stop. Everyone numbed the problem instead of treating it. In the end, Sid himself later admitted he got up to 50 milligrams of Valium a day, plus 8 tablets of the strongest sleeping pills, plus nearly a liter of whiskey. Every day. In the early '80s, he gave an interview and said straight out, "I was a walking dead man for 18 years." From 62 to 78, he even explained his thoughts. He'd wake up, take pills to fall back asleep, and the only thing he thought about was how to kill himself faster. That's not a metaphor. That's slow suicide on prescription drugs, accompanied by doctors' prescriptions. The turning point came in the late '70s when he was performing in a play somewhere in the Canadian sticks. Right on stage, he lost consciousness. They took him to the hospital. The doctors took away all his pills. They even had a room with padded walls ready in case of withdrawal. Sid, by his account, clung to the remnants of himself with his teeth and quit everything cold turkey. No gradual reduction. Cold turkey from Valium, sleeping pills, and alcohol. It's dangerous to the point of death. Benzodiazepine withdrawal can kill. But he survived. A week later, he was back on stage, barely moving, but he performed. 6 months of hell, by his memory. Shattered nerves, almost no sleep, maybe an hour here and there. But he got out. And lived to over 90, got to see his students become legends and his show called a classic. The only thing that held him all those years was his wife, Florence. 67 years of marriage, she went through all that hell beside him, raised 3 children while her husband slowly killed himself with pills. Many would have left, but she stayed. Maybe that's what ultimately saved him. Someone was there when he came back from the dead. But if Sid at least managed to get out and return to life, the next character chose a different strategy. He simply never stopped, worked non-stop for decades, turning his career into a bulletproof vest against his own feelings, and ended up a living monument to a man who had long since ceased to exist. Bob Hope was the face of American optimism for 70 years straight. A patriot with a microphone who entertained soldiers on every front, hosted the Oscars 19 times, acted, toured, smiled, and never stopped. They sold him as a man who loved his country, his wife, the stage, and people. The most stable marriage in Hollywood, 69 years together. The most devoted entertainer, lived to 100, performed into his 90s. A living legend. But if you dig just a little deeper, the first thing that crawls out is the story of how this exemplary marriage began. In the early 30s, Bob announced that he had married singer Dolores in the town of Erie, Pennsylvania. Decades later, a biographer found papers. At the time Bob supposedly married Dolores, he was still married to his vaudeville partner, Louise Troxell. The divorce from Louise was finalized only 9 months later. So either bigamy or a fake wedding date with Dolores. And characteristic, no marriage certificate for Dolores exists, no document, no photo, no record. Just a story repeated so many times everyone believed it. And Bob quietly sent Louise money for the rest of her life. There it is, the starting position. Create the right image, maintain the facade, pay off the loose ends quietly, and never stand still long enough for anyone to spot the cracks. Vaudeville gave him two things, as a biographer writes: a love for live performance and the sickness of the road. He never lost that love of movement and always seemed to be en route. The question is, was it love or addiction? The industry turned him into a machine for entertaining the troops. From 41 to 91, Bob did 57 tours for the military. Not one-off visits, but full-scale tours of combat zones, aircraft carriers, jungles, deserts. In the summer of 44, on a single tour, he flew over 30,000 miles and gave over 150 performances. 3 days after Patton landed in Sicily, Bob was already there. He got caught in bombings in North Africa. In Vietnam in 64, a bomb exploded in a hotel in Saigon 10 minutes before their arrival, and later it turned out it was a targeted attack. The detonation just happened early. The official version: patriotism and a desire to support the troops. The biographer puts it more precisely: it satisfied his compulsive need to be on stage and gave him large, always grateful audiences. Compulsive, not creative. Not a desire, but a need. Bob wasn't driven by love for the soldiers or the country. Those were side effects. What drove him was terror of silence. One actress who traveled with him to Vietnam recalled, "Wherever we went, he'd always put on impromptu shows. 3 people in the cafeteria, and Bob is already on, already entertaining." He was permanently switched on, permanently on stage. Because switched off Bob Hope was an empty space. In 65, at 62, he does 22 shows in Vietnam and visits 5 hospitals. Each show lasts over 2 hours, usually 2 performances a day, more than 4 hours of stage time daily in nearly 40-degree heat and under fire. The Viet Cong knew his schedule so well that shelling would start after every show. Bob was such a predictable target that the enemy synchronized attacks with his itinerary. And he kept coming back. That's the verdict: a man who worked 300 days a year until the end of his life. Because the one thing he feared more than war was being home alone with himself. While he crisscrossed the planet, Dolores sat at home. A Catholic, she never filed for divorce, though everyone in Hollywood knew Bob cheated regularly and openly. His daughter Linda would later write memoirs describing her father as a cold, distant man who was barely present in their lives. Bob preferred any stage, any audience, any front line, anything but a family dinner. He lived to 100, performed into his 90s, got every award there was. But the man who made millions feel loved couldn't make his own children feel wanted. Because a machine only knows how to do one thing: move forward. Stopping equals death. And if stopping is impossible, sooner or later you just forget why you even started. Next on the list is a comedian who also couldn't stop. But unlike Hope, what broke him wasn't so much the schedule as the impossibility of separating himself from the character he played for everyone, including his own family. If Bob Hope ran from home into a schedule, Red Skelton was caged by a contract long before life truly hit him. America saw a gentle clown who, in the makeup of the tramp Freddie, performed pantomimes, got tangled up in simple things, and looked so innocent you wanted to protect him. The public never suspected that under that mask was a man the studio held like property under contract. Back in the 40s, MGM wrote into his contract that without their approval, he couldn't go on radio, couldn't accept television invitations, couldn't breathe publicly at all. When, in the late 40s, Red tried to renegotiate and asked for at least permission to work in the new medium of television, the studio refused. He was trapped. Right on the lot, he'd say, "Movies aren't my field. Mine is radio and television." The studio didn't listen. They owned him for the entire term of the contract. When Red asked to be released early, they quoted him a price: $750,000. To buy himself out. He didn't have that kind of money. He stayed in the cage. On top of that, the studio was displeased that he played clown roles when they wanted to see him as a romantic lead. They wanted to control not just his schedule, but the very essence of his art. Only by 1950, after years of struggle, did the studio graciously allow him to work on TV. A small victory. But the lesson was learned. The machine owns you, and freedom costs more than you can pay. The worst blow came in the mid-50s. His son Richard was diagnosed with leukemia, 9 years old. For over a year, doctors tried to save him, gave transfusions, tried everything they could. His mother, Georgia, would go to his room and hold on with all her strength, because, she said, Richard wouldn't let her cry. He'd scold her immediately if he saw red eyes. She played strong for a dying child for a year. On May 10, 1958, in the evening, Richard had a final hemorrhage, lost consciousness, then woke up and whispered that he couldn't see anything. Everything was blurry. A little over an hour later, he was gone, 10 days before his 10th birthday. Red and Georgia sat in the hospital room with their dead son for about an hour, quietly crying. Then they drove home. To the mansion where Richard's room still had his packed suitcase, his toys, his camera, and a stuffed dog. Georgia wanted to turn off the light but couldn't. She said, "No, I don't want it to be dark in there, not today." The light stayed on. That's when the system showed its face. The network officially said, "Take as much time as you need." But Red felt that if he didn't return to his show, he wouldn't be able to calm down and make his son's life happy. The child is already dead, and the father thinks he has to work. Otherwise, this child's life won't be happy. The logic is completely broken. Unless you understand that the industry had so conditioned Red that performing had become his only way of processing anything. Laughter, as he later explained, became his only way to survive the pain. Not denial, but survival. Red went back on air. Again the clown routines, pantomimes, sweet characters, and a final "God bless you" at the end of every episode. America laughed, and in his house, the light burned in an empty child's room. Georgia couldn't take it. Grief consumed her. Depression dragged her to the bottom, and then alcohol appeared as the only way out. Both started drinking. A marriage that had survived Hollywood, the studio system, and war couldn't survive the death of a child. Trial separations began, fights, attempts to split up and come back together. In '66, 8 years after Richard's death, Georgia was found in a hotel room while on tour with Red. She had been shot in the chest with a .38 caliber pistol. She survived. The official statement, accident, possibly self-inflicted. The press speculated. Red stayed silent, because sometimes silence is safer than the truth. Whether it was a suicide attempt or an accident isn't so important. What matters is that Georgia Skelton was broken for good. They divorced in '71, 13 years after their son's death. 13 years of trying to hold together a marriage built on a grave. In '76, on May 10th, exactly the anniversary of Richard's death, Georgia shot herself. She was 54. 16 or 18 years, sources differ, after her 9-year-old son died in the hospital, she followed him, choosing the same date. This isn't just a family tragedy, it's the industry's verdict. The system didn't kill Red Skelton directly. It just made him smile, go on stage, do pantomime, while his son was dying, while his wife was drinking herself into the ground, while everything he loved turned to ash. And he kept going. Because it was the only way to exist, they'd left him. After Georgia's death, Red married again, lived to be 97. But according to those who knew him, something had changed. The humor slowed down, the pauses got longer, the innocence took on a heavy aftertaste. Inside, he was hollowed out. And if you think it can't get any worse, the last character on our list will show you what happens when the industry decides not just to squeeze an artist dry or break him from within, but to literally kill him through the law, publicly, methodically, with the participation of prosecutors, judges, and the church. Jack Benny was the perfect product of the system, the eternal 39-year-old miser with a violin who could get more laughs with a pause than others could with a whole monologue. 40 years on radio and television, impeccable timing, a perfectly calibrated image. America saw a mild, shy comedian who supposedly played the violin badly and was always pinching pennies. In reality, he was a man who doubled his workload at 66 because stopping seemed scarier than death. It all started before Jack Benny even existed. When his mother was dying in 1917, she kept him by her bedside for 10 days and, before she died, didn't say farewell words but issued a command. You will continue your studies. Not a request, an order from the grave. She wanted a concert violinist. She got a vaudeville comedian who turned the violin into a prop for jokes. Biographers write that he never forgave himself for this failure. Even in old age, he started seriously studying again, as if trying to reach across the decades to his mother's ghost and prove, I made it. By the 20s, he had everything the system promises: money, fame, bookings in the best venues in New York. And he was dead tired. Suddenly felt old, pathetic, sick from all-night parties, from meaningless conversations with crowds of people. He said a phrase to a friend that would later be repeated in every biography. There are a million people around constantly, and I'm lonely. There it is, the main trap of a comedian. You create intimacy with millions, but intimacy with one person requires you to be not Jack Benny, but someone else. And the system doesn't allow that. In 27, he married a girl named Sadie Marks, who later became Mary Livingstone. He promised her a normal life. The industry decided otherwise. When Mary's sister came to Jack and said he couldn't treat her younger sister that way, he snapped. You think I don't want the same thing? A home, children, just once to sleep in my own bed? But the system didn't give them that chance. Mary became part of the show, part of the Jack Benny program. A biographer writes harshly, a non-professional who just followed her husband got all the suffering of show business and none of the glamour. A string of hotels and a string of pretty girls who'd say, oh, I didn't know Jack was married. The cruel irony is that Jack made Mary a star to keep her close, and by doing so locked her in the same cage. By the 50s, Mary had developed such severe stage fright that she could barely function. For years, she'd pre-record her lines, and during live broadcasts, their daughter Joan would stand in for her while Mary's voice was edited in later. In 58, Mary left show business for good, broken by the same machine that built her husband. That's the verdict. Jack Benny created the image of a perfect marriage, dragged his wife on stage so he wouldn't lose her, and the industry methodically destroyed her while he kept smiling at the camera. In the early 30s, he did something that looked like professional suicide. He went to MGM and tore up his movie contract. He became tanned, healthy, and scared to death. He was afraid of returning to Broadway tanned, healthy, happy, and forgotten. That fear of being forgotten drove him until the very end. No ratings, no awards, no millions of fans could silence it. His producer and personal manager would later write in a biography that he loved Jack like a father or a son. A father because he was older. A son because he seemed so helpless and dependent in everything except creating and performing his show. Helpless, dependent. Off stage, Jack Benny didn't know who he was. At 60, when most people think about retirement, Jack doubled his workload. He switched to weekly television appearances for the first time in 11 seasons. Show business veterans didn't understand. This regimen had already felled younger, more famous comedians. Jackie Gleason, Milton Berle, other stars. Why would a millionaire over 60 do this? Jack explained simply, Mary said I hate the pressure of specials, so a weekly show will be easier. Read that again. At 66, he chose more work to reduce stress. He was so hooked on the conveyor belt that stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. The weekly show kept him in shape, in the groove. If an episode flopped, not a tragedy. If a special flopped, a tragedy. Jack Benny had so internalized the audience's judgment that he could no longer distinguish their disappointment from his own destruction. On radio, he joked about his terrible violin playing. In reality, he was an accomplished musician, good enough that his mother once dreamed of concert halls. But good enough was never good enough. In one episode, his music teacher tries to commit suicide after a lesson, and Jack falls into a depression. It was played for laughs, but the insecurity was real. Even in his final years, he couldn't stop. His daughter Joan recalled that he was always busy. The locomotive of his career had no brakes. In unfinished memoirs that Mary and Joan completed after his death, Jack wrote, "I'm like a passenger on a train, enjoying the scenery. And when the train arrives at the last station, I get off, look around. I like the place I've ended up. I don't know exactly how I got here, but I'm glad to be here." The passive voice gives everything away. He wasn't driving the train, he was a passenger. Everything happened to him, success, fame, the endless schedule, and he just rode along. I don't know how I got here. 50 years of performing, and he never understood the journey. He was too busy checking if the audience was still watching. Jack Benny died of pancreatic cancer in December 1974. Even on his deathbed, he was managing other people's careers, advising his manager to go to George Burns. After his death, Mary received a single long-stemmed rose every day. Jack had it written into his will. Even from the grave, he kept playing the role of the devoted husband. The roses stopped coming when Mary died in '83. If you look at all 10 of these stories together, you see the same pattern. The industry finds talent, creates an image, sells it to millions, and then calmly watches as the person under that image slowly suffocates, loses family, health, sanity, and ultimately the very ability to be anything other than a commodity. Groucho lost Julius. Jerry lost Dean and 6 sons. Milton chased a number into old age. Peter never knew who he was. Danny locked himself in a penthouse. Sid was a walking dead man for 18 years. Bob ran to war from home. Red smiled while his son died and his wife drank herself to death. Jack doubled his workload at 66 to avoid feeling the emptiness. But the last character will show you what happens when the system decides not just to squeeze an artist dry or break him from within, but to destroy him publicly, methodically, and completely legally, with the help of judges, prosecutors, and the full force of the state apparatus. Lenny Bruce said what others were afraid even to think. Religion, power, hypocrisy, race, sex. Everything 50s America swept under the rug, he laid out on stage with words that would first make the audience freeze, then explode with laughter. Because it was the truth. In '61, on February 4th, at Carnegie Hall, he gave a performance his biographer would call the greatest of his career. The hall was packed to capacity. The show ran past midnight. Lenny at the top. 3 years later, he'd be bankrupt, an outcast, a man reading court transcripts instead of jokes to emptying rooms. The first arrest came 8 months after that triumph. October '61, a club in San Francisco, charged with obscenity for the word cocksucker and for the statement that to come is a verb. They arrested him for grammar wrapped in a sexual context. His lawyer won the case, comparing Lenny to Aristophanes and Swift. The jury acquitted him. But this wasn't the end. It was the starter's pistol. Prosecutors across the country now knew his name. Over the next 2 years, 15 arrests. For words. October '62, December '62, January '63, April '64. The list grows like the criminal record of a serial offender. Only the crime here is one. Lenny went on stage and said out loud what others whispered behind closed doors. Here's where the really nasty part emerges. In '63, Manhattan prosecutor Frank Hogan launched an investigation in tandem with Cardinal Spellman, head of the New York Archdiocese. Church and state, hand in hand, against one comedian. Police started threatening clubs. If you book Bruce, we'll revoke your liquor license. They stopped booking him, not because he was bad, but because the law came with him and took your business. The money ran out. Every arrest meant lawyers. Every trial meant expenses. Income evaporated. Clubs were afraid of him, and bills piled up. By the mid-'60s, Lenny Bruce was bankrupt. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was that he started to break on stage. Instead of jokes, he'd read court transcripts. Audiences came to laugh and got a monologue about the First Amendment and procedural violations. The law ate the comedian from the inside, turned him into a paranoid with a folder of documents. That's the verdict. When the state decides to destroy you, it doesn't shoot. It just arrests you 15 times in a row until you break. By the end of '64, he was convicted in New York for obscenity, sentenced to 4 months of correctional facilities. At the sentencing, he stood in torn jeans and a striped t-shirt and spent over an hour trying to explain to the judge that his humor wasn't pornography, but satire. He ended with 5 words, "Just watch my performance once." The judge refused. Lenny was released on bail and kept falling apart. By the summer of '66, he was on morphine. Doctors prescribed painkillers, first legally, then he switched to heroin. According to accounts, his last years he barely left the house, rarely worked, lived in isolation and a chemical haze. On August 3, 1966, he was found in the bathroom of his Hollywood home, naked, pants around his ankles, a syringe nearby, a burnt bottle cap, and other evidence of drug use. Official cause? Acute morphine poisoning. He was 40 years old. And then something happened that didn't occur with any of the previous 9. One of the prosecutors, Vincent Cuccia, who had participated in the persecution, later publicly admitted, "I feel terrible about Bruce. We drove him into poverty and bankruptcy, and then we killed him. I watched him fall apart piece by piece. It's the only thing I'm ashamed of in Hogan's office. We all knew what we were doing. We used the law to kill him." Read that again. We used the law to kill him. Not he died of an overdose, not drug addiction took him. We killed him. With the law, deliberately. In 1970, 4 years after his death, the conviction was overturned. Turned out Lenny was right. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that obscene words are protected by the First Amendment. In 2003, the governor of New York issued Lenny Bruce a posthumous pardon, the first in the state's history. 37 years later, the state admitted, "We were wrong." But by then, Groucho had been in his grave for 20 years, never having gotten Julius back. Jerry was also dead, having left 6 sons without an inheritance. Milton died without ever getting real applause. Peter was buried at 54, empty. Danny burned out in loneliness. Sid survived but spent 18 years a dead man. Bob worked 100 years and never came home. Red's wife shot herself on the anniversary of their son's death. Jack died in harness, and Lenny just didn't live long enough to see his vindication. All 10 stories about the same thing. The industry takes a person, turns them into a product, squeezes them dry, and then calmly watches them fall, because the next one is already waiting on the conveyor belt. Here's what unites all these 10 stories. The industry found a formula to turn a living person into a brand, and then calmly watch as they suffocate under the weight of their own image. The scheme is simple to the point of cynicism. First, they need you because you're funny, talented, unique. They give you a contract, a stage, a camera, millions of eyes. And then they explain the rules. You're no longer a person, you're a product. And a product has no right to fatigue, depression, doubt, or simply the desire to stop. Groucho lost his name at 24 and never got it back for the rest of his life. Jerry tried to control everything because once he'd been left, and control became his only defense. Milton chased a number that proved he existed. Peter never knew who he was without makeup. Danny locked himself in a penthouse because downstairs waited his puppeteer wife and an audience demanding smiles. Sid was a walking dead man for 18 years because 90 minutes of live TV every week crushed him like a press. Bob ran to the front because home held nothing but emptiness. Red smiled while his son died and his wife drank herself to death. Jack doubled his workload at 66 so he wouldn't have to be alone with himself. And Lenny just spoke the truth out loud, and for that, they killed him with the law. 10 men, 10 ways to break. 1 customer. And if you think these are stories from the past, museum horror about black and white movies and old microphones, here's the news. The mechanism never went anywhere. It just updated its interface. Today, instead of a studio contract, it's an algorithm demanding content every day. Instead of Nielsen ratings, it's views and engagement. Instead of prosecutors arresting you for words, it's moderation banning you for tone. The machine got faster, smarter, more global. But the essence is the same. You're needed as long as you turn a profit, and when you break, there's already a line waiting for your spot. These 10 comedians made millions of people feel joy, warmth, relief. They made other people's lives easier while their own turned into hell. And not one of those who used them, studios, producers, sponsors, prosecutors, ever faced any consequences for it. Because the system doesn't break when people break. The system just finds the next one. And there are hundreds of such stories in Hollywood. Comedians are just one category. Next come actresses, whom studios turned into dolls and threw away when they stopped being young. Musicians, whom contracts milked for every last cent. Directors, whom the system first worshipped and then erased from memory for a single failure. Child stars who never managed to grow up because the industry simply never let them go. Hollywood knows how to break people in 1,000 different ways. This was just one of them.